Good afternoon, and welcome to another episode of The Real Thomas Jefferson. I'm Dr. Rich Billotto, and I'll be today's guest host of episode number 44. The aim of this show, The Real Thomas Jefferson, is to get real about Thomas Jefferson, to revisit and revise the revisionists in the business of deconstructing Jefferson's prose, his letters, addresses, memos, etc. Nearly all Jeffersonian biographers today take it upon themselves to write of Jefferson's two-facedness, one face being that what Jefferson writes most often cannot be understood literally. His prose must be deconstructed, and so intuitiveness and knack are needed in preference to logical acumen. It is commonplace to call the man a hypocrite and even a contradiction. This show then aims to dispel that myth that Jefferson can be known through a literal interpretation of his writings, and logic, not intuitive and discretionary deconstruction, is the method. I'd like to introduce Dr. Holowchak. He is a professor of philosophy and history. He taught at institutions such as the Universities of Pittsburgh and Michigan, Rutgers University, Camden. He is author, editor of over 70 books and nearly 400 published essays, both formal and informal, on topics such as ethics, ancient philosophy, science, psychoanalysis, and critical thinking. His current research is on Thomas Jefferson. He is acknowledged by many scholars to be the world's foremost authority and published over 250 essays, formal and informal, and 28.
Dog here. He's got to get up in the show. Come on, Jeff. Go ahead.
Hey, Jeff. And 28 books on Thomas Jefferson. He also writes on Ukraine. Colonel Holowchak and I today critically discuss the six-part series on Thomas Jefferson by the History Channel. We're fortunate enough to have with us lawyer William Hyland, author of In Defense of Thomas Jefferson. To begin, I asked the Colonel for some words on his assessment of the participants in the series. We will then turn to William Hyland, who will give us his assessment of the series. The focus will be on race and Jefferson's avowed relationship with Sally Hemings.
Yeah, before I begin, talk about the players in the series, talk about Bill Hyland's book In Defense of Thomas Jefferson. When I was cutting my philosophical eye teeth, I guess, on Thomas Jefferson early in my career on Jefferson, his book In Defense of Thomas Jefferson I read, and I enjoyed it much. I thought it's a very compelling case that if Jefferson were to, there it is. Yeah, it's a good book. And if the case were to go into court, it would be thrown out. And that's very telling, I should say, because in courtroom, what's admitted is relevant, available evidence, right? And a lot of the anecdotal stuff that people build a case, we'll talk about that. Bill will talk about that as we go on. Anyway, so some of the players in this, as I note, this really is a stacked deck. You've got Peter Onuf, who's the emeritus University of Virginia professor. He says in the series, there's something cool, even cold about Jefferson. You can't really get close to him. When you know Peter Onuf, you would say that about Peter Onuf. He's a very cold person. So the pot calling the kettle black. Frank Cogliano, who was the director, I think, of the Smith Center, wrote a book, Thomas Jefferson, Reputation and Legacy. He's in with the Onuf crowd. Annette Gordon-Reed, who's at Harvard in the history department. She began as a lawyer. And, she is the person who's responsible for much of the fervor we have today about Jefferson and Sally Hemings. I think her work, I don't think very much of her work, but she's won numerous awards for her stuff, her fable on Jefferson, Sally Hemings. Susan Kern, who wrote The Jeffersons at Shadwell, which was a good book. I enjoyed it. When I've seen her in her little episodes in the series, in the first two parts I saw, she's oftentimes very angry. You can see that. And that suggests to me she certainly, with the rest of the crowd, doesn't like Jefferson. Paul Finkelman, we talked of him last week, and Finkelman himself is not a good friend, not very favorable to Thomas Jefferson, the legacy of Thomas Jefferson. He said he's the scariest person that he knows. Anyways, and then we have John Meacham, who is, I think he still is, Bill, is he still on the Uh, is he was vice president of Thomas Jefferson Foundation? Is that still the case?
Yeah, I think he's still on the board, but he's very, very well liked by the Thomas Jefferson Foundation.
Yeah, he wrote the Art Thomas Jefferson, The Art of Power. Very good book. He's a very good writer. Problem with that is that he says nothing new at all. And he buys into the Sally Hemings myth uncritically. And what I dislike about the book is that he really is just borrowing from other sources and putting it all together. And he's a good enough writer, we can get away with it. The book sold quite a bit. We had Vincent Cunningham, an African-American writer for New Yorker. Naya Bates, who's a senior fellow of African-American history at Jefferson's Monticello. John Avalon was, in the episodes I've seen, a very surprising contributor. He wrote the book Washington's Farewell. He was a speechwriter for Rudy Giuliani, and I think his contribution is unsung, perhaps. I think he does. And we have Bill Barker as well, who's a Thomas Jefferson historical interpreter. He also is a fount for knowledge on Jefferson. I think he's a very intelligent person, knows Jefferson quite well. We get cameos by Andrew Burstein, who's a student of Peter Onuf. He's at LSU. Johann Neem is brought in there. He's written a couple books. And Steve Edinburgh is in the video plays. He's another Jefferson impersonator, and I met him in Philadelphia. I think he resides in Philadelphia. He's very good. He also knows quite a bit about Thomas Jefferson. So those are the cast of characters. Before we introduced William Hyland, I just want to say this is pretty much a stacked deck. You know what you're going to get. You're going to get a decent overall background of the life of Thomas Jefferson, and you're going to get episodes everywhere about his racism and about his unwillingness to free his slaves and about his affair with Sally Hemings. So, Bill, you have the advantage of Rich and I of having watched the whole series through, and we're just going to let you talk, and we'll cut in when we have something to say.
Great, great. And let me just add two anecdotes about the players who were on the series. Peter Onuf, who Dr. Ken Wallenborn, who wrote the minority opinion on the Monticello report, knew him very, very well. And he told me a story that I think is really fitting about Onuf. When he was a professor and he was the Jefferson Chair in the history department, he had the great Houdin bust of Thomas Jefferson on his desk, dressed in sunglasses, a baseball hat turned around with a sign that says, "My meal ticket." So this is the type of person that we're dealing with as far as Jefferson. And I will tell one other anecdote about Bill Barker. Bill Barker is perhaps the most objective and probably the most knowledgeable of all the players on this series. He was at Williamsburg as a actor and portrayer of Jefferson for a lot of years, and then he was persuaded to go to Monticello. And I gave a talk at Williamsburg, and in fact, it was on C-SPAN. And Bill Barker came to the talk, and he told me privately afterwards, he said, "I totally agree with you. The story is completely preposterous. It's out of character of Jefferson that he would have an affair with a slave, 14-year-old slave girl, Sally Hemings, but I just can't say that publicly because of the political situation here at Williamsburg and at Monticello." So I thought those two things were interesting. As far as the series, it was really slanted. And
I would add, when you talk about Onuf, it's also revelatory that his email address at University of Virginia was dude@UVA. You know, he really thought, and he continues to think himself as a really cool, hip dude. And yeah, his interest in Thomas Jefferson was more with revising and cutting Jefferson down to size. He has an express, he told me even in an email, he told me when we first were introduced through email, he said he thought I was the best up and coming new scholar on Jefferson in the world. He won't talk to me anymore. But he thinks he's, and I think really believe that he's the one that created Annette Gordon-Reed when he allowed her book in 1997 to get published.
Oh, absolutely. I totally agree. As far as the series go, it really only had two themes. One, denigrating Jefferson as a slaveholder, and two, denigrating him as a hypocrite because he had an ongoing 40-year affair with Sally Hemings. And in fairness, I don't think that's balanced and objective in looking at Thomas Jefferson. In fact, giving a public perception of Thomas Jefferson. Those are two very negative perceptions, one completely false that I think I proved in my book, but two, the fact that he was a slave owner is what's called presentism. It means we apply the 21st century standards to 18th century mores and lifestyles. And I could go on, a whole subject about Jefferson and slavery. The fact that Jefferson, and this was not brought out in the series, that, he had a great conversation with a Black mathematician, Benjamin Banneker, later on in his life, who really changed his views on slavery. Jefferson became really an abolitionist later in life. He just couldn't say that in public. He had a conundrum his whole life. He knew slavery was wrong. He knew owning slaves was, contradiction to his words. But on the same hand, he had no concept of how to abolish slavery without ruining the Southern economy. So in a couple quotes that I would just tell about Jefferson,
Well, before you get to the quotes, let me ask you, why do you think that he sort of became an abolitionist? I would say he was an abolitionist all of his life. He expressly was, and he just acting on it was difficult. It was a very expensive proposition.
Very expensive. Yeah, very expensive, and he didn't know how to deal with it. He left it to the next generation. In fact, he talked a great deal with his grandson, Thomas Jefferson Randolph, about abolition and about slavery and about how to deal with slavery. And in fact, he predicted that there would be a civil war on slavery if it wasn't kind of compromised or addressed in some fashion. And his grandson became a fervent abolitionist when he ran for office, Thomas Jefferson.
You're talking about Query 18 of his notes on Virginia, where he talks about
right.
the
Right.
Civil War.
But, one of the quotes that, they left out of the show, Jefferson said, quote, "The Almighty has no attribute which can take side with us in such a contest. He regarded slavery as a moral depravity and, quote, an abominable crime." He wrote, quote, "Have I ever been able to conceive how any rational being could propose happiness to himself from the exercise of power over others?" So the whole series was denigrating Jefferson as a slaveholder. And then they go in and episodes 3, 4, 5, and 6 all deal with him going to Paris and starting this, quote, 40-year sexual affair with Sally Hemings. And there was no debate, no other side of the coin of the debate with showing that the scant evidence that it was not Jefferson. It most probably was his younger brother, Randolph Jefferson, and the two Carr brothers, who were the real lovers of Thomas Jefferson. And we can talk about that at length. But again, the whole series was completely biased, completely slanted. The two themes were, one, Jefferson was a hypocrite because he owned slaves, and two, he was a hypocrite because he had a 40-year sexual affair with a 14-year-old slave girl, Sally Hemings. Completely false.
He was 14 when she came to Paris.
8 years. She was 8 years old when he left for Paris. His supposed seductress and mistress, 8 years old when he left.
You're not attracted to 14-year-old girls, Bill? Come on. No?
I'll take the fifth on that one, but no. And
No,
Jefferson, again, it would be preposterously out of character for Thomas Jefferson. Unlike his brother, kind of a half-wit farmer who the slaves documented came out to play his fiddle half the night and was among the black slaves, he was most probably, most credibly, the father of Eston Hemmings, the DNA match.
That was a quote from Isaac Jefferson, who was a slave of Thomas Jefferson. He's the one who, and that's an eyewitness testimony. That's
Eyewitness?
Yes.
Eyewitness testimony, and there are four other eyewitnesses. Four other eyewitnesses that the series did not even touch upon.
Wait, go back. Who was the eyewitness testimony and what did they? I was distracted for part of a second. And I think you may have addressed one of the questions that I have.
It was slave Isaac Jefferson.
Yeah.
What did Isaac Jefferson see?
He saw.
Go ahead.
Yeah, the younger brother of Thomas Jefferson was Randolph Jefferson.
Right.
He was a farmer who lived in Scottsville, about 20 miles from Charlottesville. Isaac Jefferson said that Master Randolph, meaning Randolph Jefferson, used to come out at night, play his fiddle, and act a fool with the slaves. And Randolph Jefferson, the younger brother, was documented to be at Monticello 9 months before Sally Hemings conceived Eston Hemings, the DNA match. But we have four other eyewitnesses. Not only that gentleman, but we have his overseer, Edmund Bacon, saying that he saw somebody, a male, not Thomas Jefferson, coming out of Sally's cabin many a morning when he went up early to open Monticello. Not Thomas Jefferson, most probably either Randolph Jefferson, Peter, or Samuel Carr. We also have Martha Jefferson and two others, Thomas Jefferson Randolph, the grandson, and Martha Coolidge, the granddaughter. Both of them overheard and admitted from Samuel and Peter Carr that they had an alleged affair with either Sally or Critta Hemings. And that's direct, what's called admission by a party opponent in the law, even though that's hearsay. They also said Martha Jefferson proved that Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings were away from each other for 15 months, almost a year and a half, before she gave birth to Eston Hemings, which completely destroys basically the concept that Jefferson was there at all times that she conceived. So really, we have four eyewitnesses. And the other side,
you didn't mention John Adams' wife.
Yeah, Abigail. Yeah. Abigail, who met Sally Hemings, said she was nothing but a child, immature child, when she met her when she came to London with Polly, the daughter.
That's not an eyewitness, but the four that you mentioned are more relevant. Those are crucial.
Let me add to that. I mean, when Sally comes at 14 to London en route to go into Paris, Abigail Adams meets her and notes that I think we talked about this, Rich, notes that she is functioning at a level beneath Mary Jefferson, and Mary's 8 at the time. Right. So if we draw the implications of that out, is that slave Sally Hemings is less mature than Maria, who's 8. Mm-hmm. And she says this in 2 letters to Thomas Jefferson. And what sort of irks me here is however cute she might have been at 14 years old, if she's functioning at a level of a 7-year-old, say, you're going to tell me that Thomas Jefferson is just going to drop everything and fall madly in love with I agree.
And I think that that's from what you've talked about in your previous videos. I agree, it would be inconsistent, but from an outsider looking at it, they might see this as here's a 14-year-old with delayed maturation mentally. They can more easily be taken advantage of by someone, an older gentleman who is wily of the world. But with the eyewitnesses, the 4 eyewitnesses that Bill brings out, I think that information should be taken into account in the Bayesian analyses that you've mentioned before and you've written on, Colonel. Put that into the feedback loop. If you have the probability that Thomas Jefferson fathered these children, given that you have these eyewitnesses. Bill, did you include these eyewitnesses in your book?
I did. And there are two other points that should be made about Jefferson and Sally in Paris. First and foremost, when the DNA study was done in 1998, they did a DNA study of the slave Tom Woodson and his descendants because it was alleged that Sally was pregnant when she came back with Jefferson from Paris. The DNA absolutely, scientifically, 110% ruled out any Jefferson male being the father if she was pregnant of that baby that she had in Paris. That's number one. Number two, he had a very flirtatious, even romantic affair with Maria Causeway in Paris, someone who was very similar in age, temperament, refinement, cultural background to his wife, who had just died 4 years earlier. So if he was going to have any type of relationship, romantic, sexual, it would have been with Maria Causeway, not a 14-year-old enslaved woman. But I think the DNA that the series did not talk about at all, except that it matched Thomas Jefferson, which it did not, because it was never taken from him or any of his male descendants, because he didn't have any male children. They did not talk about the Woodson DNA. If he had an affair with Sally and she was pregnant, and it matched, he was the only Jefferson in Paris. So it would be an absolute certainty that he would be the father, and that would be the death knell of that argument. But it did not match, no male Jefferson. And they did not mention that at all in
Well,
the
that was the
series.
Woodson.
Tom
That was the
Woodson.
Woodson lad who was supposed to be the son of Thomas Jefferson. They tested descendants of him and didn't get a match. And all this is predicated on the 1873 published testimony of Madison Hemings, who was the second from last child of Sally Hemings. Eston was the last. In Madison, 1783, in Pike County Republican, we talked to this in some other videos, comes out and says Thomas Jefferson, decades after Jefferson dies, and he's an older man, he comes out, he's in Ohio, and he says, Jefferson was my father, the father of all my siblings. And no one else in the family ever mentioned that. And this caused a stir for a slumping newspaper. And of course, this is going to cause a major stir. And he certainly got paid handsomely for his quote unquote testimony. And it's questionable.
Is there evidence that he got paid?
No, we don't know. Not that I know of. But I mean, it's a reasonable assumption. Why is he going to come out? Why is he going to come out and do all this?
But I just don't want to have the deconstructionists accuse you of doing what they're doing by saying he certainly.
Yeah, the deconstructionists are the ones who have all the certainty claims.
Right.
Jefferson, Sally Hemings definitely stayed with Thomas Jefferson at his residence, Hotel Languedoc, with his secretary and numerous other people who were there all times, with all the attendants and servants. And of course, and Bill, you know this, a 40-year relationship. Martha Jefferson, his daughter, said Jefferson was tired. At one point, we had up to 50 people staying uninvited at Monticello, eating us out of house and home, drinking the wine, horses eating all the hay. And Jefferson is still having this affair with Sally Hemings while this is all, and no one over 40 years saw one thing between the two. Not one act of intimacy. That is just too much to buy.
But we do have eyewitnesses that have seen his brother and the cars, and that I haven't gotten that far.
What? All that evidence doesn't condemn Jefferson. It's strongly suggestive.
It does.
We do have, as I know, you said 5. I think there are 4 real eyewitness testimonies that really create problems for Jefferson's, the pro-paternity people, how many eyewitness testimonies that we have pro-paternity? Zero. Zero. And yet these people in 2018, right, the president of Monticello, Leslie Green Bowman, comes out and says, it's a fact now. We don't even have to argue it. We can take Hyland's book, Holowchak's 2 books on the issue, throw them into the rubbish because we know it's a fact, even though there's no eyewitness testimony on behalf of it. And the DNA evidence doesn't show anything concretely, only one bit of evidence.
And let me add about Madison Hemmings' interview. We don't know what Madison Hemmings said. It was highly edited, probably written by the abolitionist editor S.F. Wetmore at the time, 50 years after Thomas Jefferson died, 1873. There's some things in his interview that are monumentally wrong that Madison Hemmings said. One, that he was named by Dolly Madison, and she was at Monticello when he was born. We know that factually is incorrect. She was in Washington at the time. Number 2, he said that Jefferson had very little interest in agricultural pursuits, unlike George Washington. That, again, is monumentally wrong, as we know from many, the memorandum books, the garden books, Monticello itself. So we have a abolitionist editor putting in words like French for pregnant, and we don't even know if Madison was.
Enceinte.
Yeah. I mean, that's really ludicrous that to think that he actually wrote or said those words. But that in the series is one of the main things that Annette Gordon-Reed says, that because the established, meaning the white historians at Monticello, meaning Dumas Malone and Merrill Peterson, rejected his interview. And she basically implies that they rejected his interview because they are white and he was black. That is monumentally wrong. And I'm going to read a quote from Dumas Malone. If anybody knew Jefferson, anyone closely knew this complicated person, it was Dumas Malone, because he spent 45 years researching and writing 6 volumes. But here's what he said, quote, "From my understanding of his character, temperament, and judgment, I do not believe that he would have done that with a woman of any sort. If I find the story unbelievable, it is not because of Sally's color." So that is what really I objected to in the entire series. They inject race into this. Is not a racial issue. I am a trial lawyer, a litigation lawyer. I deal with facts, evidence, and eyewitness testimony. And race should not be in any way, shape, or form in this discussion about Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson. That is totally irrelevant. The only relevant evidence is if and when, what is the evidence that Thomas Jefferson had an affair? It's scant. The only thing they have is the 1998 DNA match to a male Jefferson, and they have taken that.
One sample, by the way.
One sample, and they've said that he was the father of 5 of his children. Complete speculation, rank speculation, conjecture. And again, one other historian, David Meyer at Capital University, said it best. He said, the role of historians is not to make people feel good about their family history. The role of historians is to interpret based on objective methodology. So however much the Hemmings want to believe that Thomas Jefferson, the iconic statesman, want to be their descendant, the evidence is just not true. And there's compelling, overwhelming evidence that it's not true, and that most probably Randolph Jefferson and the Carr brothers were the paramours of Sally Hemings.
Yeah, it's very interesting that I did some research on this, and Eston Hemings was in line with having Jefferson DNA, not necessarily Thomas Jefferson, but someone in the Jefferson family was supposedly 6'1", 6'1.5". When you look at records from Ohio when they did censuses, Madison Hemmings was 5'7", I believe, 5'7.5", a radical difference in height between the two. No one actually brought that out, and there's some reason to believe that Eston was lighter skinned and so forth, and Madison was darker skinned. We know Madison lived in the Black community near Chillicothe, Ohio, which is some evidence that he probably couldn't pass for white. Jefferson always wanted, when he freed slaves, or when slaves were in a situation where they could be freed, that they were light enough skin. Number one, we mentioned this, Rich. And number two, that they had a trade, something they could do, so that they weren't, being victimized wherever they went and put back into, for all intents and purposes, slave position. I want to go back. You mentioned the argument from character. Gordon-Reed in her, and if you have either of you have any notion, I mentioned this in both of my books on Sally Hemings Jefferson. This argument from character, Gordon-Reed takes herself to have blocked this in her monumental book, Thomas Jefferson, Sally Hemings, which I think is a complete waste of printer's ink. And I say that simply because she's arguing that Jefferson could have had an affair. Well, Jefferson could have had an affair with the farmer's dog next to him, next to his residence. Could have had lust for paper. I mean, he says, I can't live without books. How did he know he didn't have a sexual thing for books? He could be masturbating while he's looking at books, consistent with, I can't live without books. This whole notion, and Gordon-Reed says you can't say anything definitive about the argument from character. In other words, from a Freudian perspective, or psychoanalytic perspective, that someone who is obsessed about reading, writing, and studying science, what we call in psychoanalysis sublimation, which I think is a valid phenomenon. I sublimate a lot myself, right? You turn away from erotic concerns to some extent, and you take your quote unquote eros, as Freud would say. I don't take this literally, but you take you shift your erotic interests into other things that are socially acceptable, like doing science, doing politics, whatever. And I think that Jefferson is just one of these people that he was so clumsy, I've argued in my books, that with women, it doesn't mean that I was clumsy with Sally Hemings if there were such a thing as an affair. But, he just wasn't, as Malone says, he wasn't the sort of person who would have been interested in Sally Hemings. If he had any interest, I have my book on Jefferson Maria Cosway. He had interest in Maria Cosway, but early on she had no interest in him. So that was blocked. But he wanted someone like his wife who was cute. Sally Hemings passes the cuteness test. She doesn't pass the age test, and she doesn't pass the intelligence test and the fine arts test. His wife was brilliant. She was a musician. They would sing. He played the fiddle. She played harpsichord, whatever. And Maria Cosway was that. She could play the harpsichord. She wrote her own music, and she was one of the foremost female artists in all of Europe. That's why Jefferson fell for her.
Yep.
Why is he going to fall for an illiterate slave who's 14 and cute?
Yeah. And let's remember also, Jefferson denied the allegation. A lot of historians just gloss that over, that he never denied it in public. He denied it several times in private, not only to his Secretary of Defense, saying that the charges are completely false, except for one, that I had an advance to a married lady, Mrs. Walker, in my early years. He also denied it to his neighbor. I believe it was James Madison he denied it to. And I think it was Edward Coles, a Kentucky friend or a neighbor. He denied the charges as well. Yeah. And again, the genesis of the whole smear campaign was from James Callender. This was a political smear that Jefferson had affairs with his slaves. So this started as a political smear. And Callender, we can have a whole thing on Callender. He was just a drunk and alcoholic who committed suicide. And he was an office seeker that Jefferson denied an office to. So he had a political vent against Callender. But one of the other things that I'll just throw in at the very last, that after Jefferson's presidency ended in 1807, he came home to Monticello in 1808. He had free reign with Sally Hemings. For all those years, she never had another child after he came home from the presidency after 1808. Never.
Yeah, Jefferson was in fairly good health, in spite of what some people say. He had problems with diarrhea and things like that, but probably a lot of people did because of drinking water. Didn't drink a lot of water, but he was in fairly good health.
Actually, before we go, I had 3 questions, and we only have 3 minutes. I don't know if we're going to be able to elaborate on all of them, but one question to Bill was he denied the allegations of an affair with Sally in private. Why would he not, or both of you could maybe address it, do this in public?
He had a stance that said once he denied it in public, he would have to deny another allegation, then another allegation, then another allegation. So that was his stance, that he would never deny a scurrilous allegation in public because he felt that he would be denying it, all the time.
You feed the fire.
Sure,
yes, but he did write that 1805 letter to the Secretary of Navy that absolutely denies the charge.
The other question that I have is we talk about a possible relationship between Randolph and the Carrs as paramours of Sally Hemings. Are we using the word paramour euphemistically?
Yeah, really. I mean, it was not probably. I don't know if it was consensual or not. Samuel and Peter Carr both had affairs and admitted affairs, both with Sally, but the granddaughter says it was with the other sister, I think, Crita. I don't know if it was consensual or not. We don't know if it was consensual or not with Randolph Jefferson. So who knows? But
Okay.
the evidence suggests that they were both probably all three.
Consensuality is a very funny word.
It is.
You know that, Bill, from your practice and stuff. There's this whole notion that people have, I don't want to get into philosophical aspects, people have free will. And oftentimes when I agree to do something, psychologically, this is a lot more complicated than it is than just saying, okay, I consented verbally to something. But what's the case in the law and what's the case philosophically or psychologically is something different. But it's difficult. What I'm arguing, there are levels of maturation.
Sure.
And even consensual sex, say, between a master and a slave is hardly to be viewed as consensual because they're not on a level playing field.
Right. Lastly, what does the deconstruction or tearing down of Jefferson serve the woke deconstructionists, Annette Gordon-Reed and her group?
I don't know if it serves. I mean, it's definitely a multicultural, it's a political agenda, but they want to be a descendant of Thomas Jefferson, the icon. Nobody cares about a descendant of Randolph Jefferson. They want to be a descendant
Wonder why.
of Thomas Jefferson.
So purely just for
we got to wrap this up, Rich.
Yeah.
Why don't you take us home?
Sure. So that concludes today's episode number 44